When you're putting together the essentials of your kitchen, most people think you need measuring cups. And I don't necessarily disagree with that, but I'm here to make the argument today that everybody also needs a kitchen scale. So why do I think everyone needs a kitchen scale? To put it into one sentence, a cup does not always equal a cup, but 1 gram always equals 1 gram. And that is to say that there's going to be a lot more variation when you're using measuring cups. For one measuring cup, you would hope that it's always the exact same size as the next one, but there's got to be a little bit of variation. And similarly, there's variation in methods. I might measure my cup one way, and you might measure your cup another way. So we both think that it's 1 full cup, but they're actually 2 different amounts. Whereas 100 grams on my scale is extremely likely to be exactly 100 grams on your scale. And no matter how we measure it or how we pack it or what vessel we measure it in, it's always going to equal the same 100 grams. Now, if we get into price, let's jump into Amazon and see that both of these are pretty inexpensive, anywhere down to maybe $12 and up to $30 for the scale, and a relatively similar range for the measuring cups. Honestly, it's not a fortune of money. If you never cook, maybe it seems like more money than you want to spend, but if you spend any time at all in your kitchen and you have measuring cups, why not spend an extra $15 on a kitchen scale? But now to get into the bulk of it, I'm going to show you a couple of real life examples of exactly why I say a cup does not always equal a cup, and why I think it's better to be using a kitchen scale. So here we go. So I think the most natural place to start this experiment out with is flour, as we probably measure flour more often in cups than anything else. And I'm going to really go into depth about the flour and measuring differences, and the way that I'm going to start that out is by showing you a couple of different methods of how to measure flour and how different the results are. So the first method I'm calling the scoop method, where we take the cup and scoop the flour directly out of the bowl into the cup, level it off with a knife, and then measure how many grams that equals. After 5 attempts of measuring and weighing, my results look like this. The important numbers to remember here is an average of 143 and a variation of 15 grams. Method number 2 we're calling the spoon method, because we are going to spoon the flour into the cup with a spoon, level it off with a knife, and measure the results. As you can see, we have a much lower average of 124 grams with a variance of only 3 grams. So when we look at the results next to each other, we can see that the spoon method is certainly more consistent than the scoop method. Also, when we Google how much 1 cup of flour should weigh, it's 120 grams, so the spoon method certainly gets closer. And just for fun, to finish this off, I think some people think that they need to pack flour into the cup, so I wanted to show what that looks like by doing just kind of a general pack into the cup, and one where I tried to see how much flour I could pack into 1 cup. The normal packed cup averaged 165 grams, and the super packed got up to 188 grams of flour, which is 1.5 times more than the spoon method. Alright, so at this point you're probably thinking, so why don't we only use the spoon method? And most places on the internet or in cookbooks will probably tell you to do so, but we live in a time where for any given food item there's 10,000 recipes on the internet, and you never really know if the person whose recipe you're following used the scoop method or the spoon method. The more flour that you use, the more important this variation matters. So let's look at King Arthur's sourdough bread recipe, which is going to make 2 loaves of bread, and we see that they ask for 5 cups of flour. So if I measured mine with the spoon method and you measured yours with the scoop method, we would have a variation of, on average, 75 grams of flour, which is going to vastly change those 2 loaves of bread. So my argument here is, why not just measure it exactly with a scale? You don't have to worry about how you pack the cup, you don't have to worry about anything. You want 600 grams of flour and you get exactly that, 600 grams of flour, no matter what. Now we're going to jump into a rapid fire of segments, starting with water. Here I just have an average standalone measuring cup, which I never really know how much I'm supposed to fill up, but I'm going to fill it up as much as I can without it actually overflowing, which is going to average me 241 grams of water. Now let's compare that to one of these measuring cups, which to me seems like it should be easier because the lines are so easy to read. This averages me 230 grams of water. This gives me an average difference of 11 grams per cup, which neither are accurate because Google tells me this should be 236 grams of water. These tablespoon measurements actually prove to be pretty accurate, but if you need something that's not exactly a tablespoon, like 70 grams of butter, again, it's just going to be more consistent to use the scale, even though if you just need 1 tablespoon, like I said, this was actually pretty accurate. Putting vegetables into cup measurements doesn't really make any sense to me, but I guess that is a topic for another video. But if you insist on using cups to measure your vegetables, the size of your cuts really matter. This medium size cut gave me 142 grams for 1 cup. When I took that same cup and minced it up a lot finer, it gave me a measurement of 129 grams, which is a difference of 13 grams. And when I cut these into pretty big pieces, it gave me a measurement of 116 grams. So yeah, depending on how big you cut these and how you pack them, your measurements will be all over the place. This segment's really for anything that's kind of sticky, like honey or corn syrup, maple syrup, anything like that, because I spend all this time measuring out my perfect 1 tablespoon of honey, and then it gets stuck to my finger and stuck to the inside of the tablespoon, it gets on my counter, it makes a little bit of a mess, and it's just overall kind of frustrating, and I never feel like I'm measuring 1 tablespoon accurately. But if I'm using grams, I can just measure directly into my final vessel of wherever the honey's going, or I can tear off the bottle of honey and just measure negative grams to see how much I've poured out of the bottle. I don't really even understand how to make coffee without a scale because coffee's all about ratios. For my experiment, I measured that 1 tablespoon of whole coffee was 7 grams and 1 tablespoon of ground coffee equals 5 grams. I personally like my coffee at a ratio of 1 to 15 coffee to water, and I just don't have that level of accuracy if I'm using tablespoons and cups. So if I generally like my coffee of 40 grams of coffee to 600 grams of water, in the form of tablespoons and cups, that would be 8 tablespoons of ground coffee and 2.542372881 cups of water. So this is a good way for me to segue into my final point and eventually my conclusion of this video, but I'd like to talk about how the scale provides me creativity and freedom, which might feel a little bit counterintuitive to you because the scale is all about making precise measurements. But with those precise measurements, I'm able to experiment more and understand what the difference of things actually is. Like I said, I really love that 1 to 15 ratio of coffee, but I had to experiment at 1 to 16 and 1 to 14 to find that sweet spot of 1 to 15. And maybe you want to try something crazy like 1 to 13.3 or 1 to 15.2. And you want to get nerdy like that and try to understand exactly what it is that you like. Similarly, when you get into baking bread all comes down to ratios as well. And we measure bread in terms of hydration. And I really love that 85% sourdough hydration, but when I make Neapolitan pizza, I like it at 62%, and it took me some experimentation to get there and understand what it is that I like. It also helps me learn things. If I'm trying to make that 85% hydration dough, and the next time I do it, it feels a lot wetter than it did last time, or it feels a lot drier than it did last time, and I'm not using a scale, it's probably because I measured something that isn't actually the same. Whereas when I make that 85% with the scale, it's always 85%, and that gives me the opportunity to try things consistently and actually understand what it is that I'm doing, and then therefore learn what it means to work with that 85%. And then if I want to try 80, I know exactly what it means to work with 80, and I can start to learn and understand what it means to start doing things at different ratios. The other thing about using a scale that I really love is that it allows me to actually scale recipes easier. If I want to make my bread 10% bigger, I can just multiply all of my measurements by 1.1. But if I was trying to use cups, I don't have a tenth of a cup measuring cup. And so I can't really just make something 1 cup to 1 cup and 1/10 cup. I'd have to do something with tablespoons and teaspoons, and it just doesn't translate quite as easy. Now, the one drawback I will tell you about using a scale is that if you're trying to measure something too small, it's just not really going to work out. I know my scale doesn't really even start to pick anything up until it gets to like 2 or 3 grams. So if you're trying to measure half a teaspoon of salt, you're better off just actually measuring out half a teaspoon of salt. You're not going to get any sort of accurate reading if it's just supposed to be like 1 gram or even less than 1 gram. You can buy a scale that goes to the hundredths place or the tenths place and maybe gives you some of that accuracy, but more often than not, you're just going to buy a scale that has the 1 gram and it's not going to measure something that small. And that's pretty much it. That's all I got. Go buy a scale. There's going to be a couple linked in the description below. Give it a try. I promise that it won't hurt you. It'll only make you a little bit better at a couple of things and make your food a little bit more consistent, especially if you're doing any sort of baking. Please go buy a scale and start trying to find recipes that work in grams. All of the recipes that I give are actually measured in grams and then converted to cups if that's what you like to use. So if you're following anything that I make, you're always better off using a scale. And that's pretty much all I got. Keep watching. Tell me what kind of videos you like. Hit the like button. I don't care what you do, but just go buy a scale.